Michelle, can you give me a thumbs up that you're just seeing my presentation screen and not right? Okay, cool.
Yeah, perfect.
All right. Thanks. And thanks for the invitation. I'm trying to decide if there is pressure being the one to kick off this series or if it's a privilege because maybe I get to set the tone, right? I'm going to go with B. Just for my own sake, I'm going to go with B. All right.
Perfect.
You know, I did spend some time, you know, trying to think about what I felt would be most impactful or hopefully impactful for this group because most of you I've met in person, many of you have known or have known me for many years. And so there's a sense in which I feel like I've grown up a little bit with many of you, right? Some of you knew me as a grad student, right? When I first began getting interested in this work and, you know, turning that into a research program and faculty development and things like that. And so I come to you today, I think still with a little bit of perspective of what it was like to be in STEM as an undergraduate student, what it was like to be in STEM as a graduate student, what it was like to kind of make that change to decide to focus on STEM education as a focus of my professional life, and what lessons all of that journey has for me and my future work, but also for us as we think about creating STEM education as a space where everybody can walk in and immediately thrive, right? So I'll touch on a number of things. I really want to make sure I have enough time to hear at least a few questions from you because I do think that's really where the value added is. But I hope in the scope that I am able to provide you of my journey and of some of the stuff that we do, you get a sense not just of how I've been able to identify areas for growth in STEM education, but what I'm hopeful the community is willing to do and be brave about in terms of how we go about addressing those areas for growth. So I'll start you off back in 1999 on the campus of Morehouse College. If you were seated on that bench in this picture you're looking at, you would be more or less in the geographical center of the campus. The bench is still there. I took this picture like just before COVID, like 3 years ago. Well, COVID feels like 10 years ago, but it actually is 3 years ago. And this bench, when I went back to Morehouse College on the invitation of my mentor at the time and now friend and collaborator, Dr. Lawrence Bloomer, I went and I gave a talk and it was great, the bio department that I got a degree from, etc. But I went back to that physical bench because during my first week at Morehouse as a first year student, at the end of orientation week, which was the first week, my parents sat me down on this bench. And one thing I came to realize later on, which I didn't know at the time, is that apparently staying for orientation week is a first generation student parent thing. apparently they're known for that, right? So every other parent just drops them off and it's like, you know, you're a grown person, figure it out. No, first generation parents, no, it's almost as though the orientation is partly for them as well, right? And you get to realize a little bit later in your life how much what that experience means. Right? And I don't know how many of you might be first generation yourselves, but I think as I got a little bit older, I came to realize that there are things your parents will keep from you, not to be duplicitous, but they don't think you're ready for that information. There are things about their own lives they won't share with you until you're in your 30s. And when you get that information, you start reflecting on the sacrifices that were necessary for you to undertake your own journey, and you see it in a completely different light. A light that I won't have understood at 19 when I was sitting on this bench, when they sat next to me on opposite sides and said, "We've taken you as far as we can. Good luck." It sounds rather dismissive, but what they meant was, when I was going to get that first C in organic chemistry, yes, it was that class, followed by physics, 1. And I would call home and I would say, I am in critical danger of losing my scholarship, knowing that if I lost it, I would have to immediately withdraw from college. And feeling the knots in my stomach as I had to pick up the phone and dial that number and make that statement and prepare them for that possibility. That their response was, well, you give it a shot. You can come home if you need to. So you have to understand that now, 42-year-old Bryan, who has 2 sons, 8 and 5, assuming they go off to college, which is the plan, I would be asking things like, were you a metacognitive studier? Did you teach yourself the material? Where's the whiteboard I sent for you via Amazon Prime Squared? And it should be in your room. You should have been writing those equations out. They have no excuse when they get to that point, because their dad's a science professor, their mom's a reading specialist. They come with all the privilege in the world. But my parents could only tell me, you give it a shot. You can come home now. Now, I don't curve in my classes. I don't believe in it. I don't think it's a fair thing to do, but I gotta tell you, thank God for that physics teacher who curved, because that C+ probably should have been a D. Probably. If we had to be honest here, this story could have ended way different. But it was a kick in the pants I needed. And it was the loving arms of Dr. Lawrence Bloomer who put them around me and said, Bryan, we had a talk. Because what I'm seeing is not what I know who you can be. And it was the first, well, maybe not the first, but what, at least from the college level, it was certainly the first time at that level, I felt and I emotionally understood, maybe not in scientific speak and the papers we write and the frameworks, but in terms of just an emotional individual, it was the first time I felt what it meant to have somebody really believe in you. Not the one to say, like, you weren't good enough, so I'll give you a D. The one saying, no, I see the potential, but you know what? We're gonna have to make some changes. And so he both understood the gravity of what it meant to be who I was in that space as a first-generation college student, but wise enough to say, I'm gonna take that specific love I have for you and turn it into behaviors that are changeable. I wasn't a bad student per se. I mean, I came in with really good credentials. I had a 4-year full ride to Morehouse College. And I had a good time there. But when I reflect back on my 4 years as an undergrad, the things I remember are not whatever we covered in biochem or intro bio or math. I got grades in those classes, but I'll be completely honest with you, I do not remember 95% of that material. What I remember were the people, namely Dr. Bloomer, who said, this is not who I know you can be. And it was my first introduction to what it really means to educate. You know, for those of you who heard me give talks about, inclusive teaching, et cetera, you know, I've said it then and I'll say it again here because I'm very sensitive to people taking the wrong message from this, and that is Bryan is somehow anti-content and I think everything should just be kumbaya. And like, no. Science is a beautiful thing. We got a vaccine in like 48 hours because of science, right? I mean you think about the kinds of lives we live now and how much we are indebted to the falsification method, right? I have nothing but gratitude in my heart. But I understand, like so many scholars before me have tried to articulate, that to educate has to be more than just the stuff. And I'm saying it explicitly, but I'm telling you that I fully believe that most faculty members know this implicitly. Because when I explicitly ask them, when I run faculty development workshops, I always lead with that question. Who do you expect? Who do you want your students to become? And I'm telling you, after about 150 sessions doing this, not a single person has said, Bryan, I really want them to remember third order differentials. I really want that when they're 40, they can recite the Michaelis-Menten equation. I really hope that by then they can tell me, you know, the ways in which glucose molecules split. It's not like they don't care about that stuff. But that's not what really matters 20, 30 years from now. You're going to see that 50 times. You're going to, you know, if you go into that area of research, you'll get more deep into it. What matters is how they vote, how they make decisions, how they treat their family, how they treat their siblings, how they treat their church members, how they treat people in their neighborhood, how you ascribe to the inevitable social contract of which you cannot opt out. That is what matters. The civic engagement is what matters. And so then the questions really become, what are the things we need to be doing to prepare our students to engage in that social contract? And so the content very much matters. We need to aggressively continue to interrogate this life and this world and be in and put ourselves in situations where we can, you know, sustainably maximize the utility of our existence here. But part of that is how we treat and respect each other. So inclusion has to evolve from just cultural competency models. It has to evolve from the 2 or 3 slides you might have with Black and brown people on it. It has to evolve from, you know, we close the achievement gaps. Like, it has to evolve from that. It has to be driven by the question, who do we want our students to become? What kind of society would we like to be? And in all fairness, if any of you had the kind of science graduate school experience like I did, it is expected, if not, hold on, I'm getting some feedback from somebody who may have their mic unmuted. Let me just do a quick, all right, seems to have gone away. If you had a science grad school experience, anything like mine, I am not surprised if perhaps in the past few years was the first time you are hearing people like myself trying to articulate for the reality that the social context of the teaching and learning experience actually matters. I was brought up in a world where subject matter expertise was all you needed to teach your classroom. To me, if you take even a half a step back and look at that model, you would see it for all its ridiculousness. I'm married to a first grade teacher. I did 4 years of elementary education that were majored in Spanish, 2 years of apprenticeship training, 1 year of Teach for America. Even when she started her job, there was a 2-year apprentice level. All of that, right, to teach primary education. I spent 6 years in a lab weighing nitrogen and phosphorus samples and published papers on seagrass growth. And then somebody said, oh yeah, that makes you good enough to teach intro-bio. And there's a whole history to this. I could give you a whole separate lecture on the dismissing of teaching as an actual skill, right? There's gender discrimination implications involved there. There's race discrimination that has led to that. But beneath it, there is the post-World War II model of higher education, which privileged knowledge production over the sort of cultivation of meaning and purpose in undergraduates. So that made the research enterprise the rock star of the higher education system. And people who have research labs and patents and papers, etc. Again, it's not to say that those things don't matter, but it shouldn't come at the expense of what's going on in the classroom. And so what you're seeing now really in the last 2 decades is us trying to advocate for the primacy of that process all over again. So when I was there weighing out hundreds and hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of samples, I was told that in order to be a successful grad student, I should avoid teaching as much as possible. This was explicit. It wasn't implied. It was explicit. This is what was said. And fortunately, Bryan doesn't always listen to advice. And my TA-ship landed me in a class of beautiful students. And I feel moderately educated on this topic. Now, what, 15 years in, maybe if you include grad school? Maybe less than that. But I have to emphasize that what first opened my eyes to what the classroom can be is when I TA'd and actually just talked to these students in front of me. And one by one, I would invite them to my office to just meet. It's like before class start, we just meet for like half an hour just to get to know them. And the context here is that at an R1 university, which is where I did my master's and PhD, most of the faculty were interested in creating students who would then go on to do research like they did on the very tiny thing that they did somewhere in America. There are 100 things wrong with that model. We won't get into that today. But I think what was most egregious is that they didn't quite understand that embedded in that approach is the notion that my pathway is superior to the pathways that you might be trying to choose for yourself. What's embedded in that notion is that I am not going to take the time to listen and find out why you are making the choices associated with your pathway. So when the students were proclaiming themselves as pre-med, faculty found that infuriating because, you know, most of you are not going to be doctors anyway, and why can't you see how exciting this butterfly species I study in northern Idaho is? And like, we're not saying it's not an exciting butterfly species, but to you, right? To you, right? They have their reasons. Why don't you just take the time and ask? So when we did, what you found out, by the way, this is Florida International University. This is where I did grad school, right? If you've been to Miami, you'd know it's a mostly Hispanic populated city. If you understand the history of Miami, you would know it's driven by immigration patterns from South and Central and Caribbean, well, south of the US, Caribbean and South and Central America. And when we talk to the students, they would say things like, I am the only English speaker in my household. My parents were middle class in Cuba. And we have every intention of being middle to upper middle class in America. So in order to do that, you, student, this is the parents talking to them, need to choose either medicine, law, or if those two don't work out, maybe you could consider engineering. How engineering ended up being third, I don't know, but that's just what they told me. And so you got to understand that they saw this classroom as a very utilitarian experience. It wasn't there for the love of learning. I mean, sure, they enjoyed it, but it's a whole different thing to, I'm in a self-discovery mode. No, I'm being told of a specific pathway I need to follow. So once you understand that, you design the class with different aims. So now it's not just about chapters 1 to 20. It's about, how do I show you the breadth of things you can become in this beautiful thing called biology? How do I connect with your parents to give you the freedom to undergo that exploration? How do I show you that even though this is a Hispanic serving institution, and even though 95% of the faculty in the Department of Biology are white at that time, that this field is in fact very diverse and has a lot of people of minoritized identities doing great stuff? How do I show you that if you are truly in love with science, that medicine is only one of several pathways that are available to you? Once you start with a different set of questions, your design process is automatically different. So we start with who do you want to become? As 30,000 feet as that might be. You get a sense of what that is. And then you start thinking, I'm not making changes to the content, right? We covered, glycolysis and buffer equations just like everybody else. But the approach and the context and the discussions are different because we started with a different question. So my model, which I wrote a couple of years ago, was not meant to come up with a new world famous thing that you will now know Bryan by. It was meant to encourage you and my peers and those of you who have the privilege to run these organizations that are trying to get people to have a different mindset about what it means to transform a STEM education class. It was written to encourage people to start with a different question. And you will find that in the process of trying to answer that question, we have to be able to bring everything to the table to be questioned. We have to stop limiting ourselves by working within the confines of what the current modality is, what the current sequence of topics are, what the current quote unquote external expectations are, and what other elements of the system, how other elements of the system incentivizes, rewards, and sometimes punishes us. So when I talk about knowing yourself and knowing your students, that's a whole talk, man. I am on a mission, I'll be honest with you, I'm on a mission to help re-educate STEM faculty who typically don't see the connection of things like redlining and the GI Bill and Tuskegee and restrictive covenants and just the broader social history of the US to reforming STEM education. That's its own learning journey that I trust all of you and the people in your organizations are willing to be a part of. But I'm also referring to other more, how should I put this? Automatically accepted parts of the system. I got a chance to write a little bit about this in this essay a few years ago, and I don't think I talked about this part, but I'll share this part with you because at some point I will write about it. When I was an assistant professor, I remember, you're a young assistant professor of color, right? So most people were supportive, and I wanted to be. And given the statistics of who gets retained in STEM departments, I think it was important for a lot of people that my process was successful. And I mean that in a good way. I don't mean that to be cynical or anything like that. Right? But I also understood that people, I think Dan Ariely says it in his book, the name is slipping me, but he talks about what incentivizes people's professional behavior. And he makes the point with data that people's professional behavior is usually oriented towards the ways in which they're incentivized. So if you are a research professor and your university really rewards you for your research productivity via a bean counting method, you could care about inclusive teaching, you could want to do it, but if that requires spending more time in your classroom and thus impacting the thing that will get you the rewards, then because mortgages don't pay themselves, you are likely to fall back to, I can spend as little time on this class as I need to, because that's not what's going to get me promoted. You might want to do it, but what the institution is saying to you via that process is, But what we really value is this other stuff. You might be a full-time instructor and really want to transform your class. But if your contract is every year or every 2 years, and it's basically evaluated by like a popularity contest type student feedback form, what's the incentive? If you are a full-time instructor and your university at a research university, and your university says, we really care about education, that's our #1 priority, but your salary is like 30, 40K less than the research professor. What's the message? So we spend all this time dancing around the real issues, right? We're asking our members to reform and transform your class and consider active learning and spend time in the summer revamping your course. And when it's time to write the checks, we see an entirely different thing. And some of this stuff doesn't have to be major, right? I mean, think about it. You hire research faculty, you write in the contract, you get a course release for a year or a semester so you can set up your research program. You hire a lecturer, you hire them 1 week before class starts. So you're either saying that they can design a whole class in a week before the first day of students arrive, or you can design a class where we're not prepared to pay you to do that design. We don't consider that real work. Or just the act of teaching in and of itself is not as important as the other things we do here at this institution. The messages are there, like we choose to ignore it, but they're there. And some of them can be simply fixed. Some of them needs a bit more bravery. But the first step, the first step is admitting you have a problem. The first step is recognizing what is being communicated. So when people came to me and said, well-meaning advice, Bryan, your job is to get tenure. Just get tenure, and then when you get tenure, you can do all your radical stuff. I'm like, wait, that doesn't make any sense. How could getting tenure be a job? The job is to teach well and have a nationally recognized program and come up with innovative ideas that are relevant to your research questions. That's the job. Tenure is an assessment mechanism. And sometimes the assessment gets divorced from the thing it's assessing. So we can't assume that bean counting means that the research is great. We can't assume that 5 years of student feedback, I love them, but sometimes the way that feedback is structured is not helpful to anybody. We can't assume that it's actually measuring teaching and learning. But because we focus on the tool, but not questioning the tool itself, I get advice like, Bryan, just get tenure. I think, no. We're building a program focused on equity to answer questions about equity. And sometimes to answer those questions, I need to write papers and I need to write grants. Sometimes to answer those questions, I need to be an example of the things I'm talking about in my class, which means that I will put time into that. And that time will mean there are less papers and there's less other stuff. And you need to let me know right now if that's something you're okay with. Because if it's not, my wife and I rent for a reason. And at times that means the applied research goes and it turns into faculty development, and it turns into speeches, and it turns into relationships where I work with universities for multiple years. Because the focus is on the question, not the master's tools. That's what Audre Lorde said. Master's tools will never dismantle the big house. So you have to focus on the question. So I want to just talk about a couple of things that happens in intro bio that's reflective of our approach. And in talks where I kind of zero in on the intro bio experience a lot more squarely, there's a lot more, and it's a class with a lot of moving parts. So it's also my favorite class. I mean, I think just being able to teach an intro class is a pleasure and a privilege that I don't take lightly. what it means. And maybe I just remember myself in my first college science class and how that could be either a gateway to a really special kind of life or something that tells you you don't belong here. That to me is that it's more about the intro than the bio, right? So just a couple of things I want to talk about that are features in the class that are hopefully emblematic of this sense that I teach bio, but I really teach students, right? That's the mentality. I teach students, I teach people, right? So my goal is to uplift and motivate and inspire, while they develop some subject, in the process of them developing some subject matter expertise. One key thing was moving or changing this term office hours to student hours. And this was partly because I have a lot of first generation college students who, some of whom, by the way, assume that office hours was when the professor got time to themselves to check their email. Like, well, if you think I can check all my email in 2 hours a week, you clearly have a different perception of what I do for a living. It always cracks me up, sometimes it'll come to me, oh, what are you doing for spring break? It's like, no. Spring break is a you thing, not a me thing, right? Anyways, students are funny, man. I love them. But, to me, like the logistics around office hours are funny and silly at the same time, because even if they all came to office hours, which is the big complaint, like they never come, they never show up, even if they all came and I had a class at 1:55, where would they fit? I have 2 chairs in my office, right? It's not the Oval Office, it's a professor's office, right? So you couldn't do the math right for people to really get the kind of community and assistance they need, right? At a mostly residential campus, I was able to move off, I changed it to student hours and moved it to the dorm. We met in the basement of the dorm, right? It's a room that holds 50 people with 3 whiteboards. We average about 40 students a week. And even the ones who are doing well, they will show up. And right, and so what you do is you say, you understand DNA replication really well. I want you to work with this group of 3 and make sure they get it as well as you do, right? That means you have to ask the right questions and etc. And those are the ones who go on to become my learning assistants, right? We have it at different times every week, right? But different times, because if a student has a clash, then they would miss it for the whole semester if they had like another class at that time, right? I have commuters. Sometimes it's 6, 7 p.m. is the best time, right? If that happens to be the time, I buy pizza for everybody. Because why? Because I have food insecurity. No one's going to announce that they have food insecurity, but I know because I do an anonymous survey where I find that out, right? These are big things. I have the privilege to afford pizza for everybody once every few weeks, right? Just so long as they don't criticize my choice of Hawaiian, because they'll get a straight F if they do that. Anyway, but it's such an incredible time we spend, because now you take a class on 1:55 and you're kind of chilling with a group of 40 to 45 every week. And in that space, they're just a little bit more willing to ask that question they were afraid to ask in a bigger space, right? Talk about maybe non-class things, because, I'm kind of prodding them to kind of see other, ask other questions. The second thing I want to talk about is how we can cultivate respect for humanity in the class. This is a non-content thing, because a lot of times I've gotten feedback, not negatively per se, but just this sense that I don't disagree with what you're saying, Bryan, but I teach chemistry, so I don't really have space to do diversity things. And so my thought process on that is, where you don't teach chemistry, you teach students. So while I want the students to walk out of your chemistry class to be excellent chemists, or walk out of my class to be excellent biologists, or at least prepared to be, I understand that in order to be an excellent biologist, you need to work with diversity. You need to work with others. You need to hear different points of view. You need to be willing to have your views challenged, even the ones that you held dearly and sacred to you. And so you need to have experience being in situations where you can have those views challenged in a respectful way, and you don't feel like you're being personally disrespected, but that the falsification questioning process is part and parcel of what it means to be a scientist. And so in the class, I can design activities that models that process. So I socially engineer the group. When I make my groups, they're mixed in every way imaginable. And when they get group assignments, it's not just to, ease the grading so that they, I have less stuff to grade, at the end of a particular assignment. No. They write group essays. They write consensus pieces on Rosalind Franklin. They discuss the Black scientists who were part of the Tuskegee Study Administration. They discuss the sterilization of Latinos in California and disabled people in North Carolina up until the 70s, right? They explore the role of scientists who rubber stamped the eugenics movement, right? We don't all do the dark stuff only, right? We also talk about how great vaccines are and what we've done with climate change. Well, some parts of it. This is not a doom and gloom class. The goal is to present the full picture. And for my first generation college student from rural Texas, white identified, to my West African students who just came to the US and Rhode Island, well, when I was at Rhode Island, 2 years ago, I want them to have the tools to still effectively dialogue. And so there's a whole process I go through. There's something called guideposts, which are kind of like rules. We don't really like to use the word rules because it makes it sound very legal, but it just talks about respect for others' opinion, what it means to do something called active listening. We have a whole system to be able to give each other feedback and respectful feedback and how to act on that. It is as much a part of the class as any of the biology content. So typically in talks like this, and in most, classroom transformation talks, you're supposed to, the kids did better, we closed the achievement gap, et cetera, et cetera. Okay, we did that. Not that I don't care about it, but that as you can probably tell by now, is just sort of kind of it's only part of what we were hoping to accomplish, right? To me, when I came in on this assumption that 35% of the students were going to fail the class or withdraw, like that's just not an assumption I was willing to work with, right? So honestly, getting that percentage down to 10%, 9%, 0% in some semesters was really the easy part of this. The harder part, and by the way, I was section 4. So we started off just as bad as everybody else, and then over the semesters, including up until 2020, which is when I left, down to 10%. The harder part was the couple of things that arose from that. One was, what I call the Statue of Liberty effect, which when you are a person of color at a mostly white institution, there tends to be an unmeasured, unseen, sometimes cultural tax that you take on, where the students with minority identities flock to you. And because you commiserate and you identify and you understand, and you feel sometimes that you can provide something that is not being provided for them at other aspects of the campus, you end up taking on this labor. And sometimes that labor is given to you not necessarily intentionally, but because people have not begun to ask the right questions. So to me, if you are at an institution where you have a classroom where perhaps some of the strategies that you and many of people in your organizations talk about have found effective, the question then should be, how do you scale? What can we learn from that? What are the implications for the way we consider this practice here at University of X? What happened in my case was a lot of students who we think might struggle in this course, let's send them to that section because apparently magic is happening. See, magic is not happening. We are just teaching students, not subjects. The other piece of feedback was, well, if you're going to cut a lot of content, which we did, we cut about 40% of the content in order to, make sure we're developing skills and helping people find themselves and things like that. Well, obviously they're going to do better because they're just doing less stuff. And in fact, what you're doing, Bryan, is unethical, because when they get to upper division classes, they'll just fall flat on their face. And so we looked at the average grade in the second semester of intro bio of students coming from each section. Section 4 was my section. Even if these points were the same height, I can tell you that we cut 40% of the content and they're doing just as well. They're actually on average doing better. It's like the scariest thing for STEM faculty to do is to cut content. And I get it, I was raised in the same system. I understand the temptation. But what my experience, both as a grad student when I was starting off teaching, talking to students and getting a chance to learn what it meant to be an inclusive teacher, to my own experience in my early days as an assistant professor and teaching that class in this way, is to hopefully take a step back and re-encourage so many of my wonderful colleagues across the country to not try this technique and try that technique, and if you do this, grades will go up by 0.5%. Like, I'm not trying to be dismissive of the specific strategies approach, but I'm trying to encourage people more and more to completely reframe what they think teaching really is. What a beautiful and powerful space this is. And while I get that we all need to know what to do on Monday morning, I would like to see equal, if not more, time spent on understanding that umbilical relationship between how you educate and how society is structured, for better or for worse. Diane Ravitch, who's a K-12 scholar from NYU, wrote a book called Reign of Error. And she says in the introduction, don't come talk to me about school reform until you're willing to talk about prenatal health care for pregnant women, until you're willing to talk about universal pre-K. Like, don't come to talk to me about any of what happens in that high school or that elementary school until we first discuss these other things. And that is essentially my point. So I'll just, shameless plug here. We have a NSF grant to run it's called the Deep Teaching Residency. The first will be this summer. The deadline to apply is March 18th. So if you or any of people in your communities go to that website, you'll see the form. What we bring up and what we discuss will be a lot of what I share with you today, but obviously in much more depth. We had a couple pilot versions with an RCN grant that were great, and just the community of leaders and the ways in which people, identify things they wanted to transform over their classrooms was a really, really special experience. So we're going to have 3 more starting this summer over the next 3 years. The good news is that right now, because of the grant and because of HHMI, if you're accepted, it's pretty much free. So HHMI, once you're there, it's funded, but then we have some money to cover travel to a certain extent. So we're really hoping to attract, especially people from institutions where they typically won't have resources to send them to things like this. So I hope maybe some of your members are interested. The last thing I will close with, just over 2 minutes here, is I'll skip that. Is another project I've been working on. We've created with HHMI support an inclusive teaching massive open online course, and we wanted to really take on a different flavor to perhaps what you typically see in other online courses, and to bring in the soul and the spirituality and the emotion and the comprehensiveness of what it means to be in an inclusive space. So, we talk about motivation theory and history of redlining and all of that stuff, but we also bookend so many of the modules with artistic pieces. And a friend and colleague of mine from Rhode Island, a poet by the name of Marlon Carey, we commissioned a poem that he created that is titled by the same title of the MOOC, which is Education for Freedom. So just as a closing gesture, I wanted to share this with you. Hold on, I want to make sure. Okay. So let me share.
Freedom will not be gifted. Freedom will not be lifted from the pages of history and then handed to you like a bouquet, some undeserved token of an achievement you've not yet earned, a certificate for a lesson you've not yet learned. Freedom, unfortunately, is an acquired luxury, and the way in which it is distributed is entirely compulsory. No one is born free. We're all enslaved to the systems and the doctrines of societies that came before us, rules and regulations that have separated us into classes and pastures. We're all effectively sheep led astray by wolves in shepherd's clothing. Some students thrive while others are subjected to excessive testing and diagnosis, while at home they live in precarious situations that redefine hope, and thus school is approached with much fear and copious loathing, holding tightly to the cliff notes of their misunderstandings. Bereft of the digital security blankets, they struggle to learn in this loud and ever-worsening circus, devoid of their true purpose, exchanging quality time for adequate Wi-Fi service and essentially worthless purchases. There will be no freedom for anyone if the balance isn't shifted. So many before you had their accomplishments restricted, their lives constricted. It seems we have run adrift, and even our grief has been grifted. You are free to be a fool if you wish, free to cry, free to try, free to die, free to be distracted, but you are not exactly free to be educated. Education is only the key to the door of your ultimate liberation, a deliberate and intentional shift in your momentum, a decision to act on your need to gather more information. If you would free yourself, you must shackle yourself to the rigor and the consternation of a journey many never finish. Freedom will not be gifted. It will be sifted from the ashes of everything you knew before. The pursuit of it will always require you to do more. It will cause you to question your goals when your confidence is shaken. But freedom, true freedom, must be taken.
So I will leave my contact information for those who I don't get a chance to talk to today. But I really appreciate the time and attention. I hope you enjoyed it. Hope I gave you some ideas to think about it.
Thank you so much, Bryan. Does everyone give a virtual or audible round of applause? That was awesome. And I'll open the floor. We have a few minutes. I'll open the floor for some questions. All right, looks like Rick, you can go ahead. Rick, raise your hand.
Yeah, thanks, Michelle, and thanks, Bryan. Somebody has to go first, and I don't mind playing that role. So, Bryan, I really I think our backgrounds couldn't probably be more different in terms of our paths to college and graduate school, but I really related well to your commentary about your interaction with your research director, dissertation advisor. When I was in graduate school, my fourth year, one of my research directors said to me that if he'd known that my goal was to become a faculty member at a primarily undergraduate institution, he never would have allowed me to join his group, right? Because he was only interested in producing people who were going to be faculty members at, Ivy League or equivalent institutions, or go into industry and make a lot of money. that was just a comment. My question is this, you know, one of the group that I'm working on in this project is thinking about how to support diversification of our organizations, right? Not really focused on necessarily on students, but on supporting and being open, being perceived as being open to people of diverse backgrounds and experiences to actually participate in our organizations. And we've been thinking about the role of psychological safety in that process. I'm not asking you to comment on psychological safety, but do you have any insights for us as people who run professional development organizations about how we can support, encourage more diverse participation in our organizations?
Just so I'm clear on the question, are you saying diverse participation from both students, from all students, faculty, and staff, or are you speaking of any particular constituent?
It's really our organization. The organizations in this consortium are really focused on primarily professional development for faculty members or people who want to become faculty members, and we just generally experience a lack of representation in both people who come to learn, you know, to undertake professional development, but even more significantly, move into even leadership roles in the organizations. It's just, you know, it's a problem. And I just want, you know, it's different. I think it's different in many ways from the problem that you've been talking about with students, but I think there are some parallels. I'm just wondering whether you have any insights about that.
Yeah, well, I'll just maybe give one. I think that's a conversation we could probably have over a few glasses of wine, not just
Yes.
one. So I'll just, in the time we have, I'll just share one thought with you, and I'll sort of involve you in this thought, Rick, because I remember back in the late 2000s when I was a grad student, one of the experiences that I had that really kind of excited me about having my own classroom was seeing you and a colleague at an ESCB conference do a POGL demonstration. And in fact, the economics activity you had us do in that session, I still use this very day in my intro bio class. That's what I was talking about, with, like giving people formative experience. And what I also remember, I don't know if you remember this, you probably don't remember this. So I don't know why I remember it, but I do. In the Q&A session, there were a couple of faculty members who were very critical of you, saying that, but we can't do this flip thing because the blah, blah, blah MCAT requires us to cover such and such, right? And you responded by showing them data of students who went on and did just fine in the MCAT, if not better, whatever, right? But I remember when I heard the question, what I was hearing were faculty who were scared. They may not have actually internally disbelieved your message, but they knew that when they went back to their institutions, they didn't have power. And they, well, at least they perceived they didn't have power. And so what they have to do is they have to do things confined by what's dictated to them. MCAT says this, pharmacy school says this, you know, nursing school says this. And so we can only do what you're suggesting if it agrees with everything that all those other people are asking of us. And so that's, to me, that right there is emblematic of the bigger issue, where I to answer your question more directly now is, I hope if you haven't already begun to do this, they start having these conversations with deans and provosts and chairs. I think you have a lot of faculty out there who actually believe in your message, even though their output behavior may not suggest that. But the moment you start getting involved in advising a dean and saying, if you want your chem department to adopt a POGL strategy writ large, here are the ways in which you evaluate good teaching. Here are the ways in which you support them. Here is the kind of material you need to have in advance. Here's what your Center for Teaching and Learning need to have. Here's how you assess student outcomes in that scenario. Here's why it matters in terms of retention. Like, those are the questions that you answer in front of the people who hold the levers of power, right? And I think once you start creating an environment, right, the people who have the diverse ideas who are diverse in terms of their ethnicity, who are hoping to kind of bring their whole selves to their profession, right? Those are the environments where you feel a lot more supported to do your craft because you're not feeling like you have to adapt to a static system, right? A lot of reasons why, you know, attraction is an issue, but I think retention is an even bigger issue because you get into these situations and people make it clear like you're welcome here, but you're welcome here on our terms, right? And there's a certain extent with your organization and Sensor and, you know, some of the places I've worked with, you are actually trying to redefine the terms of what belonging means as a faculty member. And so I would hopefully support you and advise you to be aggressive and be unapologetic about that, but also be able to describe that in ways where that view can be translated into hiring policy, review policies, and things like that. So thanks for your question, but I think we like 3 minutes.
Great, thank you. Thanks.
I appreciate you all inviting me. So we'll be in touch. You know what to find. Take care, everyone.
Thank you, Bryan.
Thanks, Michelle, for calling that together.
Thanks for coming.
It was awesome.
Yeah, he's awesome and inspiring. I need to reach out to him and find out how we can help him advertise the deep teaching residency and who he'd like to see. Would he like to see people like us who probably are already closer to what he wants us to do than some people would be? Obviously, you always get better. Like I did that inclusive STEM teaching project and you always learn. So it's not like we'd just be like, oh, we're not getting anything out of this. But the flip side would be those messages go with you to another thing. So it's almost like you're more of a ripple in the pool. So I want to ask him that, get an email from that, and I can send that out to folks too. But also then how can we just help him advertise that more broadly and get more support and people taking part in it?
I mean, I'd love to say that, like, if we at UALR recruited new faculty, we wouldn't have resources to do something like that. So that'd be a great opportunity. But then his points are super valid about, hey, you get release time if you're a new research faculty away from teaching. But if you're a new teaching faculty, get right in there and teach because, you know, like there's no support to do that.
Oh yeah, the messages. What's hard about that is what he said is absolutely true. Actually, let me just go ahead and stop.